Good afternoon, everybody. Sorry we didn't get a chance to make it through a lot of your places that you are, but we know you're from far and wide, and we appreciate you being with us tonight. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and on behalf of Jews United for Democracy and Justice and Community Advocates, Inc., I welcome you to our America at Crossroads program tonight, with a special welcome to tonight's guest, Sarah Longwell, and tonight's moderator, Warren Olney. Thank you both for joining us tonight. Next week, we welcome another young American journalist and author, Greg Bluestein, who covers Georgia politics for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. He has covered national news from Georgia for the Associated Press, and he is an MSNBC and NBC News analyst. Georgia is a critical state, both because it's got a noteworthy case pending in the courts there, but also it's one of 5 critical swing states, which will probably determine next year's elections. So we are sure that you'll be interested to hear what Greg Bluestein has to say. He'll be in conversation next week with Larry Mantle. The following week, on October 11th, we welcome Speaker Emerita of the House, Nancy Pelosi, in conversation with Pat Morrison. The conversation will be wide-ranging and is sure to be interesting, informative, and compelling. For those who observe the Jewish holiday of Sukkot, we wish you a Chag Sameach, a joyous and festive holiday. Again, sorry for the registration problems. We are working on all kinds of options for making this an easier process for you all, and we'll be letting you know about that within the next couple of weeks. But you know you can always contact David or me, and we will make sure you have the link to enter the program. And also thank you for your donations, which enable us to bring these programs to you on a weekly basis. Now for a few more short program highlights, my colleague David Lehrer.
Thank you, Janice, and welcome all to another evening of America at Crossroads. Following the 2 sessions that Janice just highlighted, we will host Adam Nagorny, a star at the New York Times for decades. He served as chief political correspondent for the Times, covering 4 presidential campaigns before he came to Los Angeles to become its bureau chief here in 2010. His new book was released yesterday, entitled The Times: How the Newspaper of Record Survived Scandal, Scorn, and the Transformation of Journalism. As today's review in the Times, not by a Times correspondent, wrote, it is an important story. The Times, with its quality and resilience, are still a beacon to many. Adam's views will be the basis of his conversation with Los Angeles Times Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist Pat Morrison, as they discuss literally the transformation of journalism in the digital age. The following week, on Thursday, October 26th, we'll have a return visit from one of our most popular guests, Neil Katyal, the former Solicitor General of the United States. He has argued 50 cases before the Supreme Court. He can and will talk about all things law-related. He'll be chatting with LA's Larry Mantle. It's now my pleasure to introduce an old friend and one of our most frequent hosts, Warren Olney. He is a pillar of broadcast journalism in Southern California, with a storied career in both public and commercial TV and radio. He's been a joy to work with from our very first broadcast nearly 4 years ago. Warren?
Thanks, David, so very much. It's always great to be here, and I'm delighted to be able to introduce a remarkable guest, Sarah Longwell, who is publisher of The Bulwark. That is a news and opinion site that she launched in 2018 with Bill Kristol and Charlie Sykes. They are all never Trumpers, and they call The Bulwark a home for the politically homeless. Longwell is a lifelong traditional conservative. She's also a political strategist. She's founder of Republican Voters Against Trump. She raised $35 million against his reelection in 2020. And in the New Yorker, Susan Glasser said that Longwell embodies Trump's darkest anxieties. She's conducted hundreds of hours of focus groups with prospective voters, and she hosts a podcast called The Focus Group. She airs their views on that podcast. And Sarah Longwell, it is delightful to be with you, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Sarah Lawrence College is a place I almost went just because I thought it would be funny to be Sarah Longwell at Sarah Lawrence.
I'm not ashamed of that mistake. I'm not embarrassed by it at all. And you must not be embarrassed by being called Trump's darkest anxiety. I think that's a wonderful phrase for you.
I'd love to think that was true. I don't know how much real estate I take up in Trump's head, but I certainly, it has been one of the most awful things in the last 5 years to witness Trump's complete takeover of the Republican Party, to watch so many people that I know personally, as well as people I don't know, voters allow Trump to capture one of the country's two political parties, and to watch a bunch of people just abandon everything that they said that they stood for, whether it was limited government, free markets, American leadership in the world, to become part of a personality cult. And so, I maintain some conservative beliefs, although to be clear, I was always kind of a moderate Republican squish, a good McCain, Romney Republican. But I want nothing to do with the current iteration of the Republican Party. And as Susan Glasser said in that New Yorker profile, I've dedicated my career, or what I've spent my time doing the last 5 years, is launching a bunch of anti-Trump center-right projects: Republican Voters Against Trump, Republicans for the Rule of Law. In 2022, we were the biggest outside spender against Carrie Lake and Herschel Walker and a bunch of other anti-democracy Republicans. We try to support pro-democracy Republicans where we can. But I won't sugarcoat it for anybody. We're in a bad place right now, and the Republican Party has become a danger to itself and to the country.
This has been just an extraordinary couple of days, with events that might have an impact on the next presidential election. We have Trump's implicit threat of violence against a retiring chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. We have his entire business being called a fraud and a fantasy by a judge in New York. We have the Democratic Senator Menendez refusing to resign despite a spectacular indictment. We have Cassidy Hutchinson all over CNN and MSNBC warning about a second Trump administration. On Friday, of course, we still have another possible government shutdown. But tonight, as soon as this program is over, we have the next Republican debate at the Reagan Library in Simi Valley, which is just a few miles from where I live. I know you're going to be talking about that when it is over. But the question is, what now? Newt Gingrich says it's the most important moment in the Republican primary. What do you think?
I don't know that I agree with Newt, in large part because I think Trump has already established a lot of dominance over the Republican primary. And I think these debates tend to be kind of undercard debates, mainly for political observers to chew on. I do think there's some things that are important that we're going to learn tonight. One of the biggest problems with this Republican primary in general is that nobody's been willing to take Trump on head on, right? They've been sort of tiptoeing around him, afraid to offend his base. And as a result, nobody's made any headway against him whatsoever. And so it will be a night to figure out, is Ron DeSantis going to try to actually differentiate himself from the field? They've been claiming that it's really a two-person race between he and Trump. That prospect for them has been sort of falling apart in recent weeks. And so he's either going to have to deliver a performance tonight that revitalizes his campaign and the impression that it is a two-person race, or he's going to have to, if it doesn't go well, he's going to have to start thinking about whether or not he preserves his prospects for his political future by dropping out before he becomes a punchline in Iowa and New Hampshire. I mean, right now in New Hampshire, he's polling 5th. He's currently, based on the last polls in Iowa, he's still in 2nd place, but it's a crowded field. And Nikki Haley is actually, after the last debate, she's been gaining on him a little bit. And Donald Trump continues to just dominate in most states, not Iowa, but in most other states. He's above 50% with this electorate. And so in some ways, it feels like there's kind of the real primary, which is us accepting that Donald Trump is the nominee, and then kind of a fantasy primary where we all sit around and talk about Vivek Ramaswamy, Nikki Haley, Tim Scott, even though none of them are likely to be the nominee.
You don't think there's any chance that any of them could emerge from the debate or say something that would be so extraordinary that they might at least jump to perhaps where DeSantis was months ago?
Yeah, no, I think that's something like Nikki Haley could continue to ascend in a way that gets her to 13-14%, where she's sort of taking over the kind of like establishment lane, the donor lane. I think one of the things that happened in the last debate was Nikki Haley kind of Tim Scott had been a real donor favorite, and I think she kind of consolidated some favor among donors. The problem is that the donors continue to not realize where the locus, sort of the central locus of the party is. I mean, if you look at Vivek, DeSantis, and Trump together, they represent about 83% of the Republican Party. And Nikki Haley, Tim Scott, Mike Pence, Chris Christie, they're sort of splitting the other 16%. And that's something that I find really consistently in the focus groups that I do with Trump voters, which is there's sort of this dividing line between the before Trump times and the after Trump times. And voters are not interested in before Trump politicians. They talk about Nikki Haley and Tim Scott and Mike Pence as the establishment, as rhinos. Sometimes people talk about them as the deep state. Whereas they talk about, they say this in the focus groups all the time. They say, we're never going back, right? And this is something I think people need to get their heads around, which is that Republican primary voters have decided that the party is a new thing, that Trump has redefined what the party is and what it stands for. And that voters just say, we're not going back to that thing before. And so donors and even Mike, like you can just see it, Mike Pence, just by virtue of running, seems to think that there's a Republican Party that is there for a candidate like him. But the real truth is that Mike Pence couldn't go to a Trump rally without security to protect him from bodily harm. And so I think there's not yet been the level of reckoning there needs to be about where the party actually is. Because the fact is, like I said, about 85% want either Trump for sure or somebody who's imitating Trump quite clearly.
Here at the Reagan Library, I was listening to a little bit to, or watching a little bit of what Fox is saying in advance of that, and they're encouraging the candidates to talk like Ronald Reagan and sound like Ronald Reagan. Certainly he is a thing of the past. Is that something that's going to work for anybody?
No. There's
Are you a Reagan Republican, I should ask first?
I would certainly be closer to a Reagan Republican than a MAGA Republican. I'm kind of an HW Republican or a McCain Republican. Okay. I'd like to think I'm the kind of Republican who would say to a Republican voter who said that Barack Obama is a Muslim, that wasn't true, and who believes that sort of honor and integrity, character, around the McCain times, the Romney times, character counting was a big deal. My politics were kind of formed during the Clinton years. I was 18 in 1998, the year that Bill Clinton got impeached. And I remember thinking that it was pretty gross to have a president who was having sex with an intern who was not much older than I was, lying about it. And also the hypocrisy of sort of the feminist groups defending him. That was just formative for me politically. And at the time, it was Republicans, Bill Bennett, there's just a lot of conversation around character mattering. And that resonated with me. Which is, I think, why it was so hard for me when Trump showed up to have a bunch of people who had talked about character counting, who had sort of predicated their ideas around conservatism on the idea of objective truth and being good and decent, just sort of collapsing in the face of Trump and going along with it. I found that, well, I found it shocking, but I also found it sort of unmooring. It's actually why I started doing the focus groups, is I was trying to understand what was going on with Republican voters. And what I found actually when I started listening to Republican voters, I understood something, I guess, to me that was shocking and profound, but it was that I had been spending too much time in think tanks and too much time in Washington, D.C., because the Republican base, the Republican Party had left a long time ago. It was becoming more populist. It wanted to build a wall. It wanted somebody like Donald Trump. It was almost yearning for it. I thought Trump was kind of an accident of history, the product of a fractured field where they'd kind of split up the normie vote and Trump was over there with a plurality in his burn it all down lane. But the more I listened to voters, the more I realized that the things that I came to the conservative movement and the Republican Party for were not why they were there, and that they want this new version of the Republican Party. They want an America First Donald Trump version of the Republican Party. And that is a lot of what's driving politics right now. And it doesn't matter that he tried a coup. It doesn't matter that he's deeply unfit. In fact, and so much of it, I mean, I could go on and on about this, and clearly I am, but you know, a bunch of things have changed since I was younger, right? There is now a conservative media ecosystem that goes far beyond Fox News, that includes Newsmax and OANN and a bunch of podcasts by Steve Bannon and others who are constantly telling Republican voters that the deep state is out to get them, that Donald Trump is the only person standing between them and the socialist rule of Democrats, that even responsible, so-called responsible conservatives, like at the National Review, or somebody like Brian Kemp will tell you that Donald Trump is bad, but that Democrats are worse. And I think that that's had like a really perverse effect on our politics, where a bunch of people who staked their whole identities and their political claims on the idea of character counting have now abandoned the idea of character completely for a series of rationalizations and justifications.
There's a lot of controversy about public opinion sampling, always has been. There's a poll now that says that Trump is ahead by 10 points. The Washington Post published it, but also called it an outlier at the same time. How do you put together your focus groups, and how can you be so confident, as you obviously are, that they do in fact represent Republican voters as they are today, as opposed to how they have been in the past?
So, well, a few things. So number one, I started doing focus groups. Well, I've done focus groups my whole career because I've always sort of been a Republican strategist. But I started doing the focus groups because I was looking to see back in 2018, I thought we could primary Trump with somebody like Larry Hogan or Adam Kinzinger. And I was trying to convince myself of that by talking to voters. So I went to New Hampshire, I went to Ohio, I started doing focus groups. I quickly realized, actually, I don't think you can primary him. People are actually, they like Donald Trump. They want him to be the nominee. And then the pandemic hit, and I'd been doing focus groups here and there, but I realized that we could do them online, like over Zoom when the pandemic hit. And so I started working with different focus group facilities and saying, hey, can we do these on Zoom? And they said, sure. And so the way that I find people is I'll say, what I would like is, people who voted for Trump in 2016 and voted for Joe Biden in 2020 who live in Pennsylvania and are college educated. And we basically provide screens to get the right sample that we want. And then I talk to groups. I do them every week now because we figured out we could do them online. And we could mix and match people. We could say, hey, I want people from swing states. Hey, I want all women. Hey, I want men without college degrees. And we also figured out how to do it in bulk, basically, so that I could do them every single week. And so now for years, I have been listening to voters across the political spectrum talk about Trump, talk about the state of the country. And so I've got a very good sense of how different demographics feel about things. And so
In
it's not,
Pennsylvania.
I'm sorry.
In Pennsylvania.
No, across the country.
They're across
I
the
mean,
country. Okay.
yeah, no, we do them in Pennsylvania, but we do them
Okay,
in
I'm sorry, I thought
Michigan,
you said
Wisconsin.
you limited to Pennsylvania.
No,
Go ahead.
we started traveling in early days. We were traveling to Pennsylvania. We would drive up there all the time. Susan Glasser from the New Yorker would come with us.
Right.
But then once we could do them from Zoom, we could do them from anywhere without traveling. And so now every week we do a focus group, sometimes with two-time Trump voters, sometimes with swing voters, sometimes with Democratic voters, sometimes with women, men, Hispanics, Black voters. And so I like to think that from a qualitative standpoint, nobody has done as much work over as long a period of time as we have.
Okay, so what do you think the reaction will be to some of the things that we've been seeing this week, to the former president's threat of violence, for example, against the chair of the Joint Chiefs, to the finding by the judge that his entire business is a total fraud, and I think he even called it a fantasy at some point, or words to that effect. Is that going to affect those voters?
It's not. It's not. And I think that doing the focus groups has taught me, if it's taught me anything, it is the fact that the way you and I and many other political observers interpret politics is completely detached from the way people who are not political observers engage with politics, which is that they are living their lives. I'll never forget one of the first formative experiences I had in a focus group is I went to Ohio the day after Donald Trump stood on the stage with Vladimir Putin and sided against America's intelligence community. Washington was on fire about this. I was on fire about that. And I went into this focus group and I asked people how they felt about it. And nobody had any idea what I was talking about. And I think that there's a lot of punditry and people who sit around saying, well, people are going to know that the Trump organization, you know, has been taken away from Trump because he was inflating the property values. Voters are not going to know about this. It is difficult for them to understand. One of the things that has been abundantly clear about the Trump's legal difficulties, not even forget what just happened with the Trump organization, which I actually think will have no impact whatsoever, but the actual indictments against him, whether it's January 6th or the documents case, voters cannot tell these cases apart. You'll ask, and there was a period of time where a lot of folks said, well, even if they can't tell them apart, the cumulative weight, that will have an impact because people will see how many cases there are against him. It has the opposite effect where it becomes white noise. I hear voters say all the time, especially Trump voters. They say, it's whatever. They're out to get Trump. It's just another case. I can't tell them apart. I don't care. And so one of the things I'm constantly trying to have to orient sort of the DC media about is how little these voters actually know about these actual cases.
But what about things that Trump says personally that are attributed to him that sound to those of us who observe politics, and I think to a lot of other people as well, as really outrageous? They simply have no impact whatsoever. These people don't hear it at all. Is it cult-like in that regard? What happened to the Republican Party?
It's less that it's cult-like, and it's more that they're in media echo chambers where they don't hear these things. So one of the best things that ever happened to Donald Trump was him getting kicked off Twitter, because he sits on Truth Social and he says deranged things that nobody ever hears. And his voters don't really hear them. Maybe they hear them interpreted through Steve Bannon on his podcast, or somebody on Fox News mentions like the gist of it. But the level of derangement does not seep through. And sort of even normal voters who are on the right, let's say, who watch Bret Baier, they don't hear any of this stuff from Trump. It just doesn't get to them. And so I think that's like, it might be on MSNBC and so the left will get really upset about it. Right. So like his threat that saying Mark Milley should be killed for treason, folks on the right won't hear about it. And that's the hardest thing for people to understand. The hardest thing for people is once they have information, they assume everybody else has that same information. But media silos have made it. It took me a long time to realize this, but the number of times that I have asked voters about something that I would think would be disqualifying to just a decent person, they have no idea what I'm talking about. Or if it's so big, so like the documents case, for example, people get the documents case, like, yeah, he shouldn't have had that. But then they say, well, Biden had them and Pence had them. And so there's either they don't hear about it in their ecosystem, or they have a very strong what about Hunter Biden? Why is there a two-tiered justice system? And so the other important sort of quality to understand that runs through conservatives is this sort of grievance mentality, that these things only happen to Republicans and they're not applied to Democrats in the same way.
I forgot to mention to our audience that I will take your questions a little bit later, and you can convey them to David Lauer. I think he's explained, or you know how to do that. I hope so. Anyway, he sends them to me on my cell phone, and I get them. So you've been looking for somebody within the Republican Party who could be a credible contrary to Trump, and we've got Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, and now Mitt Romney a little more strongly than he has been, considerably more strongly than he has been before. What about Cassidy Hutchinson? Here she comes, chief of staff to the chief of staff. She admits complicity. She warns that another Trump administration would destroy a democracy. She comes across as very credible, at least on MSNBC and CNN. I don't know where else she has appeared. Probably not on some of those right-wing outlets that you're talking about.
Yeah, look, God bless Cassidy Hutchinson, and actually a lot of these young women who've been some of the only people to really
Yeah, there are
stand up
others
and
as
tell the
well.
truth.
Yeah.
But you know, she is the latest in a long list of former Trump officials who have either written books, whether it's John Bolton, or they've spoken out, or they've gone on background for other people's books. But you know, I was reading this. There's a piece by Goldberg in the Atlantic about General Milley. It's an incredible piece. You should go read it. Republican-based voters, they're not reading the Atlantic.
Yeah.
They're not going to read Cassidy Hutchinson's book, and they're going to see her as a traitor the same way they see Mike Pence as a traitor. This is one of the tough parts about breaking through, is that every single time somebody speaks out, they're sort of sent out to walk the plank on their own. And every time they do that, they get knocked down, right? They get called a traitor. Everybody attacks them. There's been on the Republican side a collective action problem. You need safety in numbers. You need a bunch of people to come out at once. You can't leave people out there on their own, because I don't know if you've seen some of the vile attacks against Cassidy, but like Peter Navarro, I mean, Trump is a real scumbag, and he sits on a throne, and underneath him are a bunch of other scumbags who say things like, we should never hire women to work in these administrations because they just come out and say these things. And Navarro called her like I mean, it was just disgusting. They're disgusting. Rudy Giuliani. I mean, the way that Trump has normalized misogyny within the Republican Party, not to mention racism and xenophobia, but you know, these women are enduring horrific attacks. I think she's done her best, but at the end of the day, CNN and MSNBC are going to talk about it. They're going to carry her, and she's going to enter into a pantheon of former Trump officials who have spoken out, who get picked up by CNN and MSNBC, and Republicans will dismiss them as part of the deep state trying to get Trump, or having motives some other way. You need to have hundreds of people come out together. All the former Trump officials come out together. They're all talking on background for books. You know, Milley can't just, I appreciate what he did. I mean, he's done an enormous amount, but he can't just sit for profiles in the Atlantic. He and Kelly and Mattis, they're going to have to say something. They're going to have to get George W. Bush to say something. They're going to have to get Condoleezza Rice to say something. It's going to have to be a big collective action if you're going to break through what is just a deep, it's hard to explain to people how much the sunk costs are for Trump, right? Why aren't they moving on to somebody else? Because they've already lost friends over Trump. They've already fought with people and gotten into Facebook fights and, you know, lost family and defended him. At this point, there is no harm in going another cycle with him. Like, the fever is not going to break. Paul Ryan is not going to rescue the Republican Party, and people should let go of that fantasy. A big thing has changed. And the only thing to do now is to deliver sustained electoral defeats against this very dangerous Trump version of the Republican Party.
So what in the meantime happens to the Republican Party, particularly if there's a shutdown, and what happens to McCarthy, and does that matter to Republicans? It certainly matters to the rest of the world, and the idea that the federal government can't function because of what these people are doing. Are they totally unable to govern? Are they simply uninterested in governing? Is that not what they're about?
I mean, I think there are some that are interested in governing. I do think they're being held like, look, I got no love for McCarthy whatsoever. But I do think he's being held hostage by sort of chaos agents, for whom shutting down the government is a badge of honor, and who have no interest in governing, none whatsoever. Matt Gaetz has no interest in governing. Lauren Boebert has no interest in governing. Paul Gosar has no interest in governing. And I'll tell you, there's the danger with chaos agents, though, is that if you're Joe Biden, you don't like to preside over chaos. Like as good as much as Republicans have done to kind of hang this shutdown on their neck and say, hey, this is our fault. We're doing this on purpose. And as much as it's an internecine fight between McCarthy and this chaos caucus, you still, if people look up, a lot of these voters, like I said, they're not following this stuff closely. They're not reading Politico. They're not reading Punchbowl News. They will look up when their check doesn't come, and they will look for somebody to blame. And Joe Biden is still a big target. And so I always think it's dangerous to have chaos when you're the president. But no, do the Republicans have like an intense interest in governing? Not really. Not really.
Well, so is the chaos likely then to reverberate against Biden rather than the Republicans, even though they're the ones responsible for it?
I'm not sure about that. I don't know. I do, like I said, I think based on what I know about voters and how little they're tuned in, my big concern is just oftentimes people blame the most visible target, which is the president of the United States, when they feel like there's chaos. I think there's a slightly less chance of that this time, just because Republicans have done such a good job of hanging it around their own necks, saying this is our fault. But again, everybody in DC will know it's Republicans' fault. Everybody who is a close political observer will understand clearly that it's Republicans' fault. The question is does your average voter in central Pennsylvania know that it's Republicans' fault? It's harder
The
to
Heritage Foundation has a plan for taking over the government, restructuring it, and apparently Stephen Miller is already lining up people to take offices, as apparently using the model that Biden did when he took office and employed a lot of people in a big hurry into the regulatory agencies and so on. They want to deregulate the regulatory agencies and give the presidency a much more power than that. Is that where the Republican Party in general is liable to go? Although I suppose I'm asking you to predict what might happen after the election. God only knows what the election will bring.
Look, I think I can paint you a very devastating picture of where the Republican Party would go if Donald Trump is the nominee. Just think for a second about who would be in his cabinet, right? So it needs to be people who have absolute loyalty, does not need to be people who, unlike the first term that sort of have consensus picks from the rest of the establishment. Mike Flynn could very easily be Secretary of State. Eastman, who tried to overturn the election, could very easily run the Department of Justice. I think you are looking at a cabinet. I mean, Trump has been very clear about what he wants to do. And I understand, what's crazy is I'm actually the optimist often, which I know I don't sound like, but I want to be clear about what I think we're facing. Because I think sometimes people can say, well, couldn't Nikki Haley still be the nominee? No. Couldn't, there is so little that could happen. I mean, you need like a big exogenous event like Trump passing away or something for him not to be the nominee, because you can't beat something with nothing. And right now there is nothing from these other candidates. The other candidates in this Republican field are defending Trump.
Okay, so then talk more about your focus groups and the possibility that people within those focus groups might in fact be inclined at some point to vote for Biden rather than Trump. And who are those people and how can they be reached? Yeah,
so I think the opportunity is not to build a pro-Biden coalition, because voters are kind of down on Biden. But there is an opportunity to continue what we had in 2020, which is an anti-Trump coalition. And that anti-Trump coalition is obviously Democrats who turn out in bigger numbers to oppose Donald Trump, which is good because Republicans turn out in bigger numbers to support Donald Trump. And I think that the anti-Trump coalition can win head to head against if it's Biden versus Trump. What I think the big threat is, and I want people to take this very seriously, is that there are third-party groups like No Labels who Democrats are not going to vote for, Trump voters aren't going to vote for, but who will appeal to the 6 to 7% of soft Republicans and right-leaning independents who make up the anti-Trump coalition, which is the majority coalition that holds this dangerous version of the Republican Party at bay, that holds Trump at bay, that keeps him out of the White House again. They will serve to reelect Trump. They won't. There is no world in which a bunch of Democrats vote for them or a bunch of Republicans and they win states. No, they will win the critical margin that is part of the anti-Trump coalition. I just did a focus group today, of swing voters, people who voted for Trump in 16, Biden in 20. If you run head to head, Biden versus Trump, they go for Biden. 8 Biden, 1 Trump. You throw a third party in there, and suddenly 6 of them are going to the third party. That's the margin. No labels. No labels.
No candidate yet.
No candidate yet. But here's the thing, it doesn't matter because these voters, this is the critical thing to understand about swing voters. They're center-right voters. They are McCain voters, they're Romney voters, they're college-educated suburban voters, and they're not really Democrats. And they voted for Biden the first time because he was normal and Trump was crazy. But they don't love what Biden's done. They're down on Biden. They're down on the economy. They think things are going badly in the country. They don't want to vote for Trump. They don't want to vote for Biden either. And so if you give them an off-ramp, they'll take it and they will reelect Trump. I tell all your friends what No Labels is doing is extremely dangerous.
Let me go to some of the questions asked by our viewers. Gary wants to know, he says, the polls suggest that millennials and Gen Z lean Democratic and will be a significant cohort in the 2024. How critical are they to Biden's chances?
Look, anytime you can improve your margins among young voters who are the least likely to turn out in any given election, if you can turn those people out, you can make a big difference. So any election politics is kind of easy. It is a big part turnout, right? And so in 2020, Democrats turned out a lot of people against Trump. Trump turns out a big coalition. And then it's about persuasion at the margins, the critical margins. And so one of the things that could really hurt Biden this time around is, let's say I do my job of convincing these college-educated suburban voters over 50 to reject Trump. They remain part of the anti-Trump coalition. But the young people who are part of the Democratic coalition don't turn out because they're frustrated with Joe Biden. They're frustrated. They don't feel like enough's been done on the economy. Their rent's really high. Inflation's been high. They don't feel like enough's been done on the environment or on, racism. I mean, I hear so many things from young voters in the focus groups where they're frustrated that enough progress hasn't been made. And if you get people just feeling like, I'm not going to turn out, I don't want to vote for either of these old guys, I'm not coming out, that can be the margin, right? When you have, let me just tell you, in 2020, Pennsylvania was decided by 1.2%. Arizona, 0.3%. Wisconsin, 0.7%. You lose a little bit of turnout with young voters. You lose a little bit of persuasion with swing voters. That's the ball game. And I am a evangelist for the margins, because the margins, our democracy is going to live or die in these incredibly small margins. And so I think that getting to young people, it's getting to Hispanics, it's getting to Black men who've been moving toward Trump, it's getting to college-educated suburban women. It is working on turnout, it is working on persuasion. Don't let anybody tell you it's one or the other. It is everything, because everything's going to matter going into 2024.
Are those groups, in particular the young people, likely to go for third parties?
No, I think the biggest problem for young people is just them staying home. The third party threat is really for people who are traditional kind of center-right moderates who don't consider themselves Democrats, who voted for Biden last time and this time ditched third party because they don't want to vote for Biden again, but also don't want to vote for Trump. But they rob Biden of the margin of victory that he needs. I mean, he's passed away, but Ask George H.W. Bush what a third party did to him. You lose those sort of center voters to a third party, and that's the margin of victory.
Phil wants to know, does Trump consorting with anti-Semites have any impact beyond Jews?
I think that I'm going to answer this in a bigger picture way. Because there's this part where, like, he has had dinner, right, with anti-Semites. And I think when that's front and center, people do look at Trump and say, oh yeah, I hate this guy. He's awful. I think that Trump is benefiting right now. One of the things I think people should work hard, and I think that they should turn out every last voter, but I don't want people to like wet their beds and panic over some of the polling that we've seen recently. Because I think that people right now, they have forgotten why they hate Trump, but they like very front and center remember why they're frustrated with Biden. But when Trump is the nominee and he is head to head with Biden, and people are reminded of the fact that he is playing footsie with Nick Fuentes and other anti-Semites and white supremacists, when they reminded of what a raging misogynist and racist he is, when they are reminded that he's not a sharp person, and a variety of other things. I think that that's sort of in your face, that'll matter again. And right now, there's this way in which, especially when he did that, when he had that dinner with Kanye and Nick Fuentes, people didn't think he was going to be the nominee. Or like a lot of people just like weren't paying attention. And so I think it will matter again. But I got to tell you, I am concerned that Trump has learned a lot of lessons, and that he will be a better general election candidate than people think. He's already telegraphing this with abortion. He's already trying to seem like the moderate on abortion in a way that Ron DeSantis can't thread that needle. Trump has a way of being all things to all people. And because he's a celebrity and because he bounces all over the place, people forgive him for some of the like, oh, Kanye is a weird anti-Semite, but he's also a celebrity, and people put it in a different kind of box than they do for quote unquote regular politicians. It's one of his superpowers.
Sue wants to know, what about the Dodd case? What about Roe versus Wade? You talked about that just a little bit, but how important is that? How important should it be? Should Biden be pushing it?
Yeah. So I think that making sure, we're going to run a program, Trump Voters Against Trump. We are going to do testimonials from all kinds of Trump voters talking about why they won't support him. And based on what we've collected so far, I know that there's going to be a lot of women talking about how the reason that they won't support him is because of the Dobbs decision. But Trump will, unlike DeSantis, if DeSantis was the nominee, abortion would be the central issue, and it would be devastating against DeSantis. Trump has this way of seeming like a moderate. Nobody thinks that sexual morality is important to Donald Trump. Nobody thinks that he's pro-life. And so secular voters, and there's a lot of them, who are Republicans, but who are pro-choice, they can sort of tell themselves like Donald Trump's not really super pro-life. He's not these crazy Mike Pence people. And that's why you've got to hang around his neck the 3 Supreme Court justices, right? Here's how he can have it both ways. He can tell the Republican base, look, I got you your judges. But he can say to swing voters, but don't worry, we're going to come up with a compromise, 15, 20 weeks, and we're not going to pass federal legislation banning abortion. Trump's one of the weird politicians who could maybe get away with that. And so it's going to take everybody reminding people all day long that he is the reason Roe v. Wade. He is the reason that Dobbs got overturned.
Karen asks, where are the big dollar Republican donors now putting their money, particularly when you say that there's really not much chance about how the primary is going to end up?
Yeah, I mean, they're basically moving their money around. So first of all, there's a lot of people saying like, well, DeSantis might drop out. DeSantis's super PAC has $97 million in the bank. I do think Republican donors, there's still like a lot of money that's just like already been invested in DeSantis. I do think there's a cadre of donors that are looking at Nikki Haley anew after that last debate, and are putting money into her. This debate tonight is going to be important to see whether or not she continues that momentum. But again, there's sort of a fantasy primary that the donors are playing where they don't understand their voters. I mean, they spend too much time at AEI conferences and with other rich Republican donors, and they have no sense of how bad it's gotten with the base, how much the base hates them and hates the candidates that they like. I do think that this cycle, like I said, there's a way to sort of tell yourself a story about the first time Donald Trump got elected. I think this time people are just now, I mean, there's so much panic in Republican donor world because they're just coming to the conclusion that voters want Trump and that they're not seeing any way out of it. They thought DeSantis was this like fusion compromise that everybody could live with. And they're realizing that that was a pipe dream, in part because DeSantis is an incompetent politician.
Sue wants to know, what do you think is the future of Speaker McCarthy? Big smile.
Well, I mean, talk about somebody who deserves everything he's getting. And on the flip side, though, where there's not an alternative that's better. I'm honestly not sure how this shutdown plays out. Like, he either has to make basically the moderate Republicans have to join with Democrats to keep it open, or Matt Gaetz and the Republican Chaos Caucus come for McCarthy and he loses his seat. The problem is it's sort of just like the Republican primary. Can't beat something with nothing. So you can see a bunch of ways in which Donald Trump could go down. Exogenous events take him down. He goes to jail. Who's the thing that takes his place, right? Who comes and excites Republican voters and they say, that's the alternative. It's the same way with McCarthy. The problem for Matt Gaetz is like, there's not somebody else they're putting forward. Scalise, who was before the one alternative that people were kind of like, well, Scalise could do it, unfortunately has blood cancer and can't do it. Like, there's not somebody else who, if it's not McCarthy, the entire group gets behind. That's why he won after 15 rounds, is that the majority of the caucus were like, it's him or nothing. And eventually the Chaos Caucus caved. They can get rid of him with their one vote, their motion to vacate. But the question is, who do they replace him with? And I don't think they have someone.
This one's old news, but what happened after McCarthy and McConnell both denounced the attack on the Capitol, said that Trump was irresponsible? And why is it that subsequently McConnell less than McCarthy, but they became Trump adherents and are willing to allow what's happening with Trump liable to win again, despite the fact that they can't look forward to the kind of government that it seems to me Trump would implement, given what you've said and what others have said as well.
Yeah. So McCarthy and McConnell are in two different camps. And this is important, actually. McConnell's in the camp that doesn't understand voters, right? So McConnell finds himself in the camp of, what's the harm in humoring him? He'll never be president again. He doesn't force people. He doesn't tell other senators to convict him. He thinks Trump's done because he misunderstands the voters the way Mike Pence misunderstands the voters and Nikki Haley misunderstands the voters, and the Republican donors underestimate and misunderstand the voters. McCarthy goes back and makes that trek to Mar-a-Lago after condemning Trump because he understands the voters. Okay. He understands that the voters demanded that he go and make peace with Donald Trump because they wanted Donald Trump. And so they're different, actually. McCarthy understands that he has to change to meet the needs of the current Republican voters, whereas McConnell thinks Republican voters are different from what they actually are. And McConnell, if you recall, blamed Donald Trump and then said, the legal system will sort this out.
Yeah.
And now that the legal system is sorting it out, they're all denouncing the legal system as a two-tiered justice system. But just never forget that McConnell and the other Republican senators, they had the ability to make sure that what's happening right now didn't happen. And they chose not to do it. They chose not to do it.
I'll ask this question. It doesn't come with a name, and I'm not sure it makes a lot of sense. But the question is there any chance that one of the cases against Trump might lead to him withdrawing in order to avoid imprisonment?
Sorry, you're gonna have to say that again. Is there what about?
I'm sorry, I'm not going to ask it again because I don't understand it. Maybe you don't either. Lana asks, could a convicted Trump be elected?
I think he could. I think it's less likely that a convicted Trump could. Look, I gotta. We're in a tough spot, guys. The voters are very down on Joe Biden, including Democratic voters. They are much more down on Vice President Kamala Harris. And so, like, when people say, could Trump win? The answer is absolutely he could win. Could he win if he's convicted? Absolutely he could. Is it more at that point 60-40? He doesn't win? Yeah, I think it helps turn off more normie center-right voters. And again, I'll go back to like why it's so problematic if no labels is in the mix here. But head to head, if Trump is convicted and he's running against Biden, I think that Biden can win. But I also think it's going to be close, and I think it's going to take every one of us, and I think it's going to take persuasion and turnout. And I don't think anybody should be comfortable that because Trump is under a bunch of federal indictments or even convicted, that he couldn't win a general election against a pretty weak incumbent. I think it's not the most likely scenario, but I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility at all.
You mentioned Kamala Harris. Judith wants to know, who might Trump pick as his vice president?
So I think there's two different routes that Trump could take. He either goes for a woman who's like an iteration of him. So like your Carrie Lakes and your Marjorie Taylor Greenes, maybe your Kristi Noems. I think having a woman is something that Trump would like to do for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is the Republican Party is pretty aware that women is where they've been weakest. Or I think that Tim Scott has actually been running as much for vice president as anything else. I think Trump would love to have a black running mate. I think he thinks that that helps him again with sort of the normie voters that are turned off by him. Happen to agree with him a little bit on that. I think Tim Scott's been running for Trump's vice president. I think that's why he's in the race. And I think that you shouldn't discount the idea that these South Carolina, I think that Nikki Haley was running for Ron DeSantis' vice president because both of them in South Carolina knew that they were the third primary state, and that after Iowa and New Hampshire, one of the leading candidates might want to cut a deal to get their 10% in South Carolina to win that state. So it wouldn't shock me if Tim Scott was Trump's choice, but it wouldn't shock me if he chose Marjorie Taylor Greene or Carrie Lake either.
Sue wants to know how the race is shaping up in the 5 swing states.
So I think I think Michigan is in pretty good shape. I think Gretchen Whitmer has been a good governor there, and I think she's done a lot for the Democratic Party there. I also think the Republicans, this is like kind of deep in the weeds, but the Republican Party there run by Christina Caramo, who ran for Secretary of State and lost this last round. She's a total election denying crazy person. And so much like in Arizona, where the Republican Party has just completely gone off the rails, in Michigan, the Republican Party is kind of in shambles. So I think they're pretty good in Michigan. I think the big races, it's going to come down to Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. Obviously, Georgia and Arizona are always in play because both of them are kind of like 11,000 votes. They're super thin margins, but Trump can win those actually, as long as Democrats hold Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. But I think Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. I think Michigan's pretty safe. I think Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, knife's edge.
What's the impact, do you think, in Wisconsin of the Republican challenge to the woman who's been elected as the state Supreme Court Chief Justice, who's liable to change the abortion laws in Wisconsin and who may be impeached before she ever takes her seat?
Yeah. Protasiewicz, I believe is her name.
Yeah.
I'm probably pronouncing
Thank
it
you.
wrong, but it's close to that. I think that Republicans Robin Voss, who's the local Republican who's been leading the charge on impeaching her, they'd be insane to do it. If they do it, I mean, the fact that she won in a landslide.
Yeah.
In part as a sort of reaction to the Dobbs decision. That race became a proxy abortion fight. I think if they impeach her, it increases the chances that Republicans lose Wisconsin in 2024. That said, we do not want it to happen, even though it might create the backlash that makes the political prospects better, because if they impeach her and put her into this kind of limbo, like they would impeach her but not get rid of her, so that just basically no ruling can get made around redistricting, which is what this is really about, other states would follow suit. Like you could see other states adopting that playbook, which we don't want to happen, where they just start impeaching justices so that they can't rule on critical cases that might impact Republicans politically.
This may be beyond your, I don't know, sphere of interest or insight, but what if Alabama refuses to obey the U.S. Supreme Court and when it comes to redistricting, which seems to be a possibility? How is that going to affect the presidential election? Would it cast doubt on the stability of the country or something of that kind, or the once again the institution of the U.S. Supreme Court, or what kind of impact might it have?
Alabama? What makes you ask about Alabama in particular?
Isn't Alabama the one where the Supreme Court said that it's rejected the reapportionment of the legislature, and there's some thought that Alabama may go ahead and enact the reapportionment that is discriminatory against blacks that the Supreme Court rejected. I'm sorry if I may have it wrong, and
well, you may have it right. If you do, I'm not really following it. I mean, I guess
okay.
Alabama's gonna go for Trump.
Sure.
And so I guess I'm not that worried about it. Incidentally, just as a crazy aside, Alabama has one of the better Republican senators in Katie Britt, who replaced, she ran against Mo Brooks, who's a crazy election denier. She's actually a pretty normal Republican, and people are pretty desperate for her to be the future of the party. I'm not that worried about Alabama because, sorry, Alabama is gone. And a bunch of these places, one of the things I try to focus on is you should not worry about convincing two-time Trump voters who are super dug in, right? Like Alabama's off the table. We are fighting for the margins in critical swing states with critical blocks of voters who are persuadable. And so I think there's a lot of that's valuable in fighting in certain places, but if you're looking for where to invest and where to focus on Pima County, Arizona, focus on Bucks County, Pennsylvania, focus on groups that are really looking to persuade or turn out critical components to make up these margins to decide the election.
You said at the outset that you're essentially an optimistic person. Given the answers that you have given to my questions and those of the viewers, you don't sound very optimistic.
I'll tell you what makes me optimistic. Back in 2022, we were one of the biggest outside spenders against Kari Lake, against Doug Mastriano. I was watching these anti-democracy candidates, and I was so scared. I was so scared that a bunch of election deniers were going to be elected governor, secretary of state in these swing states. The voters rejected them. Republican turnout was higher than Democratic turnout. But a bunch of that margin, hear me about these margins. They're everything. A margin of Republican voters voted against Kari Lake. They voted against Doug Mastriano in Pennsylvania. Josh Shapiro won by 14 points against Doug Mastriano, which means that voters, at least the right margin of them, could look at these extreme GOP candidates and say, I don't want them. And so I have hope every day that we can do that again. But it's going to take $1 billion and a ton of persuasion efforts and fighting for every single vote. But I do think it can be done. And I still have faith in the American people, or at least a margin to do it. We're going to have to build a huge new pro-democracy coalition that spans from Liz Warren to Liz Cheney in order to hold off this dangerous version of the Republican Party. But I do think we can do it. We just need to be clear-eyed about what we have to do.
Well, Sarah Longwell, publisher of The Bulwark, it's a pleasure and an education to talk with you, and thank you very much for being on our program. And we'll probably hear you talking about the Republican primary later on in the evening, and thanks very much for being with us right now.
I got to go watch this debate, guys. Good
Okay,
luck.
there you go.
Keep the faith. It was great to talk to you. Thanks for
Good to
having
have
me.
you. On October 4th, the guest is going to be Greg Bluestein. That's next week, of course. He's with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, expert on all matters related to Georgia. Fani Wallace included. He is with NBC and NBC as well. That's going to be next Wednesday, October 4th, 5 o'clock. Larry Mantle, my good friend, will be interviewing him. Thanks to you and the audience. Have good health. Stay safe.